Webinars are probably the things that I enjoy doing the most when I can't be with you in person, and I'm sure that day will come soon enough, but wanted to take a moment to focus first on social studies. Have certainly had some conversations with folks that are editorial cartoons and really the higher order thinking skills that are necessary to take a look and respond to those accurately in an exam situation is always a challenge for folks. Let's face it, there are always higher order thinking skills required to successfully look at and analyze that kind of graphic information. But also accessing text in a variety of ways and a variety of media. And so I thought the first of the 4 webinars should focus on social studies. So today we have Hot for Social Studies. We're going to really think about how to access and activate those higher order thinking skills as we move through today's presentation. So in no particular order, my objective is that we have the opportunity to explore those thinking and reading skills. If we think about reading as a process, then certainly social studies can feel a lot like a reading test because we need to access all of those kinds of skills in order to respond to a variety of text. We're also going to take a look at and identify some strategies and activities to help build content knowledge in social studies. We're going to look again at graphic literacy, and by that I mean editorial cartoons, sometimes called political cartoons, in the context of social studies. And in no particular order, again, sprinkled throughout the webinar and at the end of this webinar, we'll share some resources with you as well. I also wanted to just briefly mention that I'm going to go ahead and send a PDF of this deck to you guys so that if it's helpful to have it on hand at a future date, you're welcome to the content of this information for sure. I think it's important to really think about why do we study history, right? You know, a lot of times, and I'm getting ahead of myself trying to shut this box. It's one of those subjects sometimes in school that we think, well, I don't need this. This isn't going to help me get a job, or you know, it's not relevant to what I aspire to do or be, etc. But there's some things that happen when we study history. One, it encourages us to think critically about the world around us and how it applies to us and to our communities, but it also repeats itself. So understanding those trends and those other events that were going on around us that sort of motivated actions or help us understand why things happened the way that they did, perhaps gives us an opportunity to learn from those lessons and learn from the past and identify the things that feel familiar to us and those that are sort of new and different. I think we could even take this slide and add 2020 to it, because certainly we have a significant economic downturn that, unlike events of the past, were not strictly related to economic conditions, but a public health crisis that we found ourselves in, right? So we could take a look at these events in our past and our present and find those correlations to better understand what worked, what didn't work, and what motivated these things to happen, so that if there's an opportunity to prevent them from happening again, we have that as knowledgeable citizens in this world. Martin Luther King once said, "We're not makers of history, we are made of history." And I saw this in a previous presentation that GED did, and I thought how relevant it was to my own life. I'm sure for many of you, you could probably consider the relevance of your life experiences. I grew up mostly overseas due to my dad's military experience, and that gave me a whole other way of experiencing historical events when I was a child than I would have experienced had I been in my own hometown in the US at the time. And so it just sort of gave me some historical perspective on how that relates to me personally. We all teach adult learners, and we don't have an inordinate amount of time to give them to not just our time, but their own time to absorb years of high school social studies and traditional means of learning. So I think, we're all looking for a way to accelerate learning and make the most of the time that we have with our students and the time that they have in order to successfully complete their high school equivalency exams. And certainly with the GED, there are a number of resources that have been developed for both you as educators as well as the student to sort of take this elephant of social studies and take a bite and chew it and conquer it, all of those kinds of things. And one of those is certainly is the assessment guide that outlines our focusing themes and makes those connections to social studies practices so that students can apply skills of analyzing and evaluating to create meaning and understanding with what they're reading. And so the assessment guide goes into greater detail of these focusing themes, but it does give us an opportunity to consider how we can take this huge concept of social studies and break it down into relevant topics under relevant themes throughout each of these content areas. And, civics and government is 50% of the test. So it might make sense to sort of anchor our lessons around those topics and make those connections to history and economics and geographic conditions at the time that these events were taking place and find those connections. This session is not going to spend a lot of time on a thematic approach because I think that would be best served in a way in which we can interact with each other in person. But there are opportunities to use thematic lessons to help students increase their understanding and retention of general concepts, their ability to make decisions and think critically and creatively around these topics, and to promote cooperative learning with each other as a way of learning from peer-to-peer interaction and those kinds of things. Just as an example, we could take, this concept of the Civil War and the U.S. Constitution to make those connections between civics and government and history and the economic impact that those things have. There'd be layers and layers of opportunities to interact with the text around these topics and identify means of questioning and analyzing and coming to some conclusions around what that could look like. Certainly, there's opportunities to explore this, and this might be another workshop type session at a conference rather than today's webinar, but just to give you something to think about how you can make those connections between those sub-content areas in this exam. Another resource that you're probably very familiar with is the performance level descriptors, PLDs. Certainly, we would love for our students to achieve a higher level of performance in those levels 3 and 4. They're going to be much more prepared for various contexts to interact with complex texts, whether it's social studies or manuals and advanced learning and education and training and things like that. But this is the kind of stuff that they need to master in order to reach a minimum of a high school equivalency level in this exam, and certainly the details around that are available in your assessment guide for social studies as well. What excites me more when I think about accelerating learning for our students is really the idea of these high impact indicators. They really give everyone a bigger bang for their buck to focus on high impact indicators that develop skills and knowledge that are relevant across the content. To my mind, this gives them an opportunity to dive into cross-curricular instruction and really make the most of the time that they have. Because as you look at these high impact indicators, they are skills that can be applied across each of the content areas that we're going to take some time to talk about this month. Just as an example, I pulled this one. This is one of, in my mind, sort of a basic high impact indicator. An RLA has to do with determining meaning of words and phrases as they're used in text. So using context clues, understanding connotative and figurative meanings from text in both informational and literary text. We take that skill as it's written in RLA, and it translates across each of the content areas. For social studies, it means that we want them to be able to determine the meaning of words and phrases as they're used, basically demonstrating a knowledge of academic and content language in the context of the social studies topics and themes. And another resource to be used, and I wouldn't be shy about sharing this with your students, is the study guide. It is written to be accessible to test takers. It assures them that, you know, they should be familiar with basic social studies concept, but they don't need to know everything about social studies. And as they go through the study guide, really what continues to come up for me is the need for high order thinking skills, the ability to critically think about what we are reading, whether it is informational text or a map, a graph, an editorial cartoon, to be able to do things like determining the main idea or figuring out how authors use language, and another opportunity to look at imagery and facts to establish points of view or purpose, the ability to establish fact from opinion. And here's another one, because this really goes back to the essay that we're going to talk about next week in the RLA test. And that's, you know, the ability to determine whether or not a claim is supported by evidence when you read it and you see it, and comparing the information between sources and developing arguments as relevant in social studies. The ability to make inferences and draw conclusions is going to be needed, whether they are accessing or taking the social studies exam, or they're taking the RLA exam, or even the science exam. And so these are process skills and thinking skills that we could probably discuss ad nauseum about how that kind of skill development will help them be successful on the social studies test, even if they don't know everything about every era in time. And one of the way that we can do that is to be sure that we're introducing primary sources to students, that they understand what primary sources are, and that they understand the difference between a primary source and a secondary source and how to access it. Examples of primary sources, of course, include official documents like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, letters, diaries, that kind of thing, photographs from a particular time period, newspapers, magazines, speeches, interviews. All of these are direct sources of information, and therefore they are considered primary sources. And so if we're looking at sort of, you know, the development of the Constitution and that time and space in our history, and how that leads into other topics related to civics and government and things like that, we also have to think that those primary sources back in time may not feel as accessible as contemporary sources of information or secondary sources of information from now. And so it would be prudent to sort of think about how we make the primary sources accessible to students so that they can find meaning in them. We want to use primary sources in order to keep students engaged, connect past from present. Remember, history repeats itself. I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, I think. We want to develop critical thinking skills for them and, exercise that muscle where they may not have had the opportunity to do so. But we can help them construct their understanding of these sources by scaffolding our lessons and creating opportunities to break down their thinking and scale that up instead of looking at a piece of information and sort of leaping to conclusions without really breaking it down and considering all that text or source has to offer. So understanding primary sources, teaching primary sources certainly helps us to reach proficiency in these high impact indicators, one of which would be to determine the central ideas or information of a primary source. And if you were to access the information on the high impact indicators online, then it will also give you plenty of information as to what to look for in student work that demonstrates mastery of that indicator. If they have mastered this indicator, then they're going to be able to differentiate between the concept of topic and main idea and summarize a piece of text or be able to fully explain the relevant details that support that main idea. And then locate pieces of evidence in a text that support the main idea or claims presented. Just another example of a high impact indicator, the ability to analyze how a historical context shapes an author's point of view, and what that looks like in terms of their ability to identify the point of view in a primary source, but also identify the context, the relevant events, figures, and ideas in that text that helpfully explain that point of view. So I'm going to pause real quick before I talk about some teaching strategies around this because I don't have my chat window up and I just want to see if there's anything that needs to be addressed quickly. Okay, it looks like we're all on audio. Okay, thank you. So one way to teach primary sources is to access samples of primary sources and teach our students to read like a historian. This gives them the opportunity to look at different areas of the text, to consider the source, what surrounds the source in terms of giving it some context, and to look closely at that text through a close reading exercise, and to find sources that corroborate what they are reading. Other sources of information that shows how relevant the primary source is and the information provided in it. So how does a historian read? Oh, excuse me, I hit the wrong button. Historians look at 4 different things when reading text. So they're going to consider who wrote the text and why. The Federalist Papers are a perfect example of that. The authors were motivated to gain support for the Constitution and all that was included in it. A historian will look at what surrounds the source, their place in context and time and history. And what is the document telling me? How can I break this text down so that I understand fully the concepts included, not just the main idea, but the supporting details that support that main idea and the evidence included within that document that allows me to fully understand the purpose of this text and the point of view for this text. And then we're going to look for some corroboration, as I mentioned. So how do we know the text is authentic? How do we give it credibility? What other sources of information do we have that would lend credibility to this text as well? Let's first think about our sourcing. So before reading, we want to really fully investigate who authored the document, what is the author's point of view, if it's known beforehand, and that may depend on what you know of the author. We want to understand why it was written, what motivated the author to write this, which will also give some insight into their point of view. When was it written? And where was it written? And we can take these questions, and if we needed to, we could sort of have a pre-reading exercise, right? We could take these questions, and depending on the student, we might need to sort of put these questions in a more graphic way of understanding and analyzing them. Other students would be perfectly fine if they had it and had a peer-to-peer conversation about the same document. Others may just want to have these questions and simply answer them in their journal as to as they continue to sort of investigate the primary source. And then excuse me, is it believable? If so, why? If not, why not? What makes this source believable? And then to provide context, we want to consider some of these questions. When and where was it created? What else was going on at the time? How might the circumstances in which the document was created affect its content? We're starting to sort of evolve our thinking beyond what's written and interpreting what's written and really investigating the why behind it. And then we want to engage in the text simply by reading it thoroughly from beginning to end. And I'm not saying, you know, we want to read like the entire article of, you know, one of the Federalist papers or something like that, but we might want to just read, pull out a relevant section and make it more accessible by shortening the amount of text that a student needs to engage in, particularly initially, and certainly if it's the purpose is to pass an exam like the GED social studies exam, they're not going to be reading a text from beginning to end typically in order to respond to some questions. The relevant text will be provided for that purpose. So again, this is an opportunity to engage with the text and journal around these questions. It might mean that we need to break it down a little bit more in terms of how we represent this kind of information in a graphic organizer, but we really want our students to become investigators. And once they've engaged fully with the text provided, we then want to explore what corroborating evidence do we have in other documents. What other documents might also be reliable sources of information, et cetera. And in this area, we have a lot of opportunities to do online searching in various databases, and even the library is online almost all the time. And so this, again, further extends their thinking beyond the text into other supporting documents to support what they have read, the conclusions that they have come to about what they have read. Why is corroboration so important? You know, at first glance, we're looking at Abraham Lincoln, and, you know, obviously this picture or quote has been attributed to him, but we can't always believe what we see, especially with all the sources that are available online. There's some great databases, of course, but there are also a lot of websites out there that are subjective in nature and do not have credible primary knowledge of certain events. And you know, I think we all know Abraham Lincoln didn't exist at the time of the internet, and so we can easily identify this as false or a misstatement. But when we're thinking about the here and now and current events and how social media plays a role in many of our students' lives, and the kind of information that's posted. For some people, they're digesting their news through social media platforms and what's posted there. And so the idea of corroborating our evidence and our information that we're digesting extends above and beyond just the primary source and into some real life activities about, can I, believe everything I see? I think we probably know the answer to that, but then how do I determine what I believe out of all the things that I see and what is just trash? There are certainly some sample lesson plans and organizers that you could use at this website. There's a number of resources for you to continue your thinking around this process. And the Library of Congress also has resources. We're going to talk about the primary source analysis tool that helps us sort of understand and make those decisions around what's credible and what perhaps isn't, and breaking down the information in the primary sources. But you can certainly find many sets of primary sources to use as assets to these kinds of lessons. The primary source analysis tool allows us to encourage students to, again, break down their thinking as they access that text for the closed reading section of our exploration and ability to read and think like a historian. And so it really just kind of breaks it down into observe, reflect, and questioning, and then asks what needs further investigation. And this would be perhaps an opportunity to engage in that corroboration aspect of reading and thinking like a historian. So the primary source analysis tool encourages us to question, observe, reflect, and again, question, observe, and reflect. And once we engage in that observation, this is kind of like a pre-reading activity. We want to think about, what did we notice first? Ask students to describe anything about the text that looks unfamiliar and how that information is arranged. And that's going to be pretty simple answers for some texts, and there will be more lengthy answers for other texts, depending on the source that we're using for this exercise. When we are asking a student to reflect on a document, we want them to answer these questions in order to set the stage for reading. And of course, for me, I'm really big on pre-reading. I'm really big on setting a purpose for reading, especially if I know that it's going to be a text that is unfamiliar and maybe a little uncomfortable for the reader. And so if we can set a purpose for reading by reflecting on these questions before we read, then as we read through the text, we can begin to sort of allow our brain to process and consider these questions. And then we want the student to question the document. What claims has the author made, and what evidence is there to support those claims? Again, if you look at the study guide, this kind of questioning goes into those high impact indicators and the opportunity to develop higher order thinking skills, so that we begin to not just take what's on the page for granted, but then also consider why and how, and bring it all together in this constant cycle of questioning the text that we are accessing. That kind of process is really great for text as opposed to graphs, maps, charts. It could potentially be used in editorial cartoons, but there are other ways to look at and access that kind of media. I'm going to take a quick look at the chat box before we talk about analyzing a map, but I wanted to share this with you as well. So at the bottom of this page, I have the hyperlink to this particular graphic organizer that could be a useful tool in scaffolding how to teach students to analyze a map and to break that information down. Because if we go to something that looks like, let me see if I can get there. This, if we aren't comfortable reading maps, sometimes it can feel like we can't see the forest for the trees, right? Like we're just looking at this, we know there's some lines, there's color coding, but how do we make sense of the information that is presented to us? And how do we understand the purpose of this map and the conclusions and draw conclusions from this map as well? So I'm gonna go back to analyzing the map and just kind of discuss this with you a little bit more, because I understand that the image on your screen really isn't that great. It's just not big enough really for us to really play with too much. But in this graphic organizer, it helps the student break down their thinking step by step. And so you have an opportunity to ask the students to just kind of meet the map and, you know, what do you see about the title, what the scale, the compass, and what are those things? If they're not familiar with maps, we might need to take a minute for some folks to kind of, you know, respond to some questions around what do those things mean. Every map is going to have some kind of legend, and maybe we talk about what kind of map it is, what purpose does it fill, and then let's break it down by part. So what places do we see on this map are included in this map? What kind of labels, symbols, what do the colors and symbols represent? Who made this map? Where is it from? And if we look at this map, we might not know all of those things, but we can certainly say, you know, look at those colors and symbols and understand that, oh, those darker orange states, those are the original colonies. Okay, gotcha. And as it gets lighter, those are more recent states. Those are states that were adopted into the US as time went on. And then there's a legend that gives us all these routes of exploration and settlement that might help us come to some conclusions about what transpired to make those state adoptions possible over time. And so we can use this graphic organizer to help students make sense of what they're seeing and understand what was happening at that time in history, and draw some conclusions around why this map was created and what purpose it served, and take this and compare it to a current map. And what are the similarities and differences between these, you know, two maps? And it can allow us to gain some historical perspective. And then engage one step further by finding other sources to understand the event or topic. So it might be interesting to take a text sample of an explanation of the westward expansion or one of the routes taken in the period of westward expansion, and also pair it with this map and begin to break down and analyze the text and the map as a corroborating piece of evidence for that primary source that was the text, and give them more practice in sort of understanding what they're seeing when it's some kind of pictorial, in this case a map, versus a text. And I would suggest that you could potentially take this particular graphic organizer, make some minor modifications, and change it to helping them access graphs and charts as well. We're not going to take a whole lot of time today to talk about those specifically, but certainly the concepts are the same in terms of sort of what do I see overall and how can I break this down and what conclusions can I draw from this that makes me understand or appreciate what this information, what this media is trying to give me. What point of view or perspective am I supposed to get? What conclusions should I be able to draw from this image? I'm going to move on from the map. And we're going to talk briefly about editorial pictures. And you guys have been phenomenal. There haven't been a whole lot of questions yet, but please do feel free to use the chat if you do have any questions at any time. And if this is just sort of a refresher for you and you know, sort of there isn't anything that reinvents the wheel, I'm glad to have you and your perspective. And if there's just one little nugget for you today, I'm really thrilled by that too. So again, thank you so much for your time. But we're going to talk about what it is to evaluate editorial cartoons. I frequently, quite frankly, call them political cartoons. That's why I have that in parentheses at the title slide. But really, looking at cartoons and reading them, aside from you know, the emotional response that we give cartoons when we see them either online or, you know, in the paper, magazine, etc., whether that's, you know, a deep sigh of relief, or we laugh out loud at the ridiculousness, or just shake our head because we just can't believe it, we might agree with it, whatever those things are. The idea is we get that reaction because we've might not even have noticed that we have made inferences and drawn conclusions about that image or that cartoon. Okay, so we want to help our students come to logical conclusions about these editorial cartoons by breaking down the thinking and encouraging them to make inferences based on clues that they can explain as evidence and give reason as to why they came to that conclusion. And again, when we're looking at scaffolding lessons and accessing information, when we're sort of trying to just sort of flex that muscle that it takes to make inferences that make sense, that, you know, are based in logic and evidence, it's certainly reasonable to think about where your student is in terms of what they're familiar and comfortable with in text, because it may be easier for them to draw conclusions about advertisements before they can leap to, you know, a complex passage of informational text or fiction or any of those things. Or even, in my mind, understanding meaning from editorial cartoons really certainly is on the complex end of the spectrum. We're talking about the thinking process that goes into making those inferences. So you might want to, you know, quote unquote, start small, you know, start simple, go to those advertisements and comics, and then progress as that muscle, that thinking muscle becomes stronger. Could certainly use photographs that are more contemporary just to sort of engage in that basic thinking around what do you see, what does it remind you of. When I think about making inferences, I think about what do I see and what do I know that gives me context to come to those conclusions, right? So what does this remind you of? And we may not necessarily know the photographer's purpose, but we might be able to draw some conclusions around that based on what we see and know. And one of the things that, you know, I look at that, and if I had shown that to some of my students years ago, they just would not even know what that was, right? In fact, I have to tell you what this picture reminds me of. Not that long ago, I passed by a payphone booth, much like this. It wasn't labeled. If it had been labeled at one time, it was all scratched off and it was completely empty. And it was like, do you know what this is? And I thought, you know, it's probably been decades since I've had to use one of those, but it definitely dated me for a moment there. So we can use photos to help our students engage in the basic what feels maybe like basic thinking process, but isn't, because they're accessing higher level thinking skills to be able to draw conclusions and synthesize that information in some way, which is optimal in what we want them to be able to do for future learning. Now, using a historical photo is likely to be a little more complex for someone who doesn't understand the context of the historical photo, who can't look at this and go, oh, I know approximately the time and space that this photo was taken. And then the historical context around this photo would be important to know in order to come to a logical conclusion about this photo and what it represents, or to have that kind of response and conclusion from a photo that is not so contemporary. So we certainly want to, again, consider pairing something like a historical photo with text that will give them the context to understand and draw relevant meaning from that historical photo. So again, more complex than photographs and comics are editorial cartoons, and the process of understanding those cartoons requires us to really sort of consider the academic vocabulary that our students may or may not have, and to define that and set them up for success by, taking a moment to explain what symbolism is, caricature, exaggeration, humor and irony, and stereotypes. These are all different elements that cartoonists and illustrators use in their constructs. And so we want to ensure that we have given our students the opportunity to build their academic understanding of these concepts before we ask them to analyze a cartoon. And there's a number of ways that you could do that. If we were to look at ways in which we can analyze cartoons, just as a couple of examples, we could certainly, there are, in fact, in our resources pages, there's websites where you can access additional editorial cartoons by eras and current events, etc. But we want students to be able to consider what the event or issue is that inspired the cartoon, whether or not there's real people illustrated in the cartoon or not. It might be a cartoon character or a caricature of a person. We want them to be able to look at this picture and consider the symbols and what the cartoonist's opinion about the topic portrayed in the cartoon might be, and whether or not the student agrees or disagrees with the cartoon. And just as a resource, you'll find in our webinar archives a handbook or handouts around analyzing cartoons. One to the right is for the novice. It breaks things down a little bit more. It has a little bit more graphic image, pictorial images to stimulate that thinking. And then there's another one on the left that, again, much like analyzing maps, asks the students to really think about what it is they're seeing and then break it down into the parts in order to make sense of it. And so there's two different graphic organizers. I've included the link in our resources pages on this webinar as well, that you could certainly download from our website. There's another one that I wanted to share with you after we discuss this a little bit, because, again, it's about knowing your student. Could they take these series of questions and respond to them in a journal? Or does something like a graphic organizer help them organize their thinking so that they can break down the pieces? And again, this one in particular, this is, obviously not a current event type cartoon that you would find online given today or the current events in last weeks and months. We know this because we know who Hoover was, we know who Roosevelt was, but we might need to break down this image by responding to these questions or using a graphic organizer to break down a student's thinking in greater detail and taking smaller bites out of it. Another graphic organizer that I sometimes used with students who could use something a little more broad is just something that takes this image. And again, if we want them to come to some conclusions around it, then taking the time about what they see, what they know about what they see, the conclusions they can draw upon that. And in the end, given all of this evidence and your conclusions, what can we say about the illustrator's point of view or perspective in the event or topic that they have illustrated? I'm going to let you digest that for just a moment before I move on. I'm going to take that moment to just double check to make sure there aren't any questions. Okay. Thank you so much for all your kindnesses, but I don't see questions per se. So I apologize if I missed one. Please feel free to re-enter it if I did. But I'm going to take a moment now to just kind of review some resources for you. I purposely sort of set this at sort of 45-ish minutes of my talking, and to give plenty of time for comments and questions at the end. So please don't feel shy, okay? From our website, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, we have performance level indicators for each of those score levels by content exam. So if there's any new teachers on today's webinar that has not been working with students with GED on their minds for a while, that is a great resource for you, because it does, again, share with you what a student would have to know to be proficient at that particular skill or score performance level kind of thing. It breaks it down into 4 levels for you. And then there's the Educator's Handbook. And for all of you, and I know some of you have been around for quite some time, our Educator's Handbook actually was revised late last year. And so you may find that there are still some new nuggets of information for you veterans, as well as anyone who is new to prepping for GED or high school equivalency. So you might find that to be useful. I became a big fan of high impact indicators. Many of you know, you've seen me around Mississippi for a long time. I've just been with GED for the last almost 6 months now. But the idea of these high impact indicators have an opportunity to just pay off in spades if we can figure out how to incorporate them across the curriculum and across the content areas. So, and they're listed separately by content, but there is also a cross content chart. That's where I got my image from, if you remember that from earlier in the presentation. And so, it's all there for you to sort of mine how you can make the most of your time with students. And upon a closer look at the study guides, they do give samples of those questions related to each of the content areas and the topics within those content areas. But they also sort of break down the what and why for students in very accessible terms. It's not, I'll be honest, the first time I looked at the performance level indicators, I was overwhelmed by the amount of information included in that particular document. And then as I sort of dug into that, and then also pulled the study guides and other resources, I realized, I had a framework, and then the performance level indicators were kind of like picking up puzzle pieces that filled in that framework for me. So that's just my thought process around it. You might have different ideas, but I would certainly not be shy about ensuring that your students who have chosen to take the GED test have an opportunity to take a look at those study guides for themselves. And all of these resources can be found at this hyperlink. If you want to give your students more practice with a variety of questions and challenge them to think critically and have exposure to those higher order thinking skills through questioning, I cannot recommend GED Flash enough. It is in collaboration with Aztec. Certainly the Aztec rep for the state can give you more information on that, but it does give you an opportunity to also look at time on task and proficiency developed with that time on task. There's a lot of data analytics with that, but it gives them the opportunity to practice independently so that they have a wide range of questions that you didn't have to come up with, and sort of extend that learning through independent practice. So I would certainly encourage you to think about that as well. If you have any questions about how to access GED Flash, please let me know. Happy to help. I believe they extended their 30-day free trial because we're all sort of sheltering in place to varying degrees, depends on what state you're in. And so that could be, a pretty good resource to access for students as we continue to encourage them to question and respond to questions and that kind of thing. As I mentioned before, there are a number of resources for you around primary sources and core documents, and I'm just going to let this speak for itself. If you're not familiar with these websites, then certainly the links are still relevant and you're welcome to use those. You might be familiar with the National Archive, so if you're looking for primary sources, for social studies content, this also would be a great resource to consider. I believe it's free. You have to sign up for it, but it should be free to you. And then there's the Annenberg Classroom, which gives you some additional resources around civics education. Some additional resources, the Digital History Reader, some sample lesson plans and organizers, so you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. We mentioned this one earlier when we were talking about reading like a historian, but there are many other lesson plans and organizers available to you on this website. And there are lessons for classrooms. So iCivic does require that you create sort of a user profile, if you will, but it is free. So there are certainly some resources for you to consider to enhance your curriculum there as well. And just one more, the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and News and Life Binders. And so much more information available to you there as well. I'm going to take a pause for a moment and check to see if there's any questions. I don't see any, but you're welcome to take a moment and submit some questions if you have any thoughts. Please feel free to send them my way. We have a quiet group today. For those of you who need to get ready for other obligations, please feel free to do so. Tiara, I'm going to hang on just in case we might have a slow typer or some thought going on, if you don't mind, for another minute or two. But certainly if anyone needs to take care of some business, I completely understand. I thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope you'll join me next week when we talk about the RLA exam.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shannon. So Tiara, the one question I have is how to get the PowerPoint, and I wondered if you had a means to send it out if I were to send it a PDF version to you. Would that be possible?
Yes, I'll upload it into our Canvas course, and it will be there along with the recording.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, with that, Tiara, I haven't seen any. Oh, I spoke too soon.
Yeah.
Are the instructors able to sign up for the 30-minute GD flash trial? Yes, my understanding, and if you will email me, in fact, I'm going to give you I didn't, should have fast forwarded just one more time. If you will send me your email, I will make sure I have the right contact for you from Aztec for that. But I believe the trial that they are giving gives you access to GD Flash for organizations, which means that I think they do like X number of seats or something like that. I'm not sure, but I do believe you'd have access to either the test taker version or the Flash for organizations, which would be really helpful for you. Certainly feel free to email me and I'll get the right contact for you if you don't know your Aztec rep for Mississippi. I think that's it, Tiara. Everybody has been so gracious, but I have come to expect no less from Mississippi. Thank you so much again. Thank you for making this possible, Tiara, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Yes, no, thank you, Jana, for the great information. And we look forward to seeing you, talking with you on next Thursday.
Absolutely. Take care, guys.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shannon.
You guys stay safe.
You too.